Dennis Nilsen was one of Britain's most prolific serial killers, killing at least 12 men between 1978 and 1983. Born in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, Nilsen moved to North London in 1973 after working for the Metropolitan Police, where he started killing men and boys 5 years later. Nilsen's death toll is disputed, with the convicted murderer claiming to have killed 15 people. He is said to have tried to kill 7 more people. Nilsen strangled nearly all of his victims, and in some cases rendered them unconscious. He hid the body in his apartment, set it on fire a few days later, then dissected it, cooked it and threw it down the drain. The official was also a necrophiliac, a person sexually attracted to corpses. Nilsen admitted to having sex with 6 of the victims' corpses. In February 1983, police arrested a plumber responding to complaints from Nilsen and his neighbors after he discovered human remains in a sewer system on Nilsen's Cranley Gardens property. During police questioning, Nilsen admitted that the bodies were kept in a car box in the living room, where body parts of 3 men were found. However, Nilsen failed to name some of the victims and provided police with only vague profiles of the victims. Police have identified 6 victims: Stephen Holmes, Kenneth Oakenden, Malcolm Barlow, John Howlett, Graham Allen and Stephen Sinclair. At least 6 of Nilsen's victims have not been identified. Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder in October 1983. He was found guilty of all charges. The convicted felon was sentenced to life in prison, with judges recommending a minimum of 25 years in prison. He died on May 10, 2018, aged 72. Most love fights end with an apology. But for Katherine Knight, murder and mutilation were the end result. Not only did this Australian abattoir worker stab her lover with a butcher knife at least 37 times in February 2000, she then chopped him up, cooked him, and prepared to serve him to his own children. Born on October 24, 1955, in Tenterfield, Australia, Katherine Mary Knight was the product of a scandalous affair between her mother, Barbara Rowan, and her father, Ken Knight. Rowan was not only already a mother of 4 boys with another man, but she even met Knight through her husband. When their secret rendezvous came to light, it rocked their small conservative town. Following this tumultuous start, Knight's chaotic childhood didn't get much better from there. Her father was a violent alcoholic who raped her mother multiple times a day. Knight herself claims that she was sexually assaulted by several family members until the age of 11. In school, Knight was known as a bully who terrorized smaller children. Without ever learning how to read or write, she quit at the age of 15 to work at a clothing factory. A year later, she landed her dream job at a slaughterhouse cutting out the internal organs of animals. The beginning of Katherine Knight and John Price's relationship was without complications. He had 2 older children who lived with him and seemed to like Knight, and he made enough money as a minor to keep her comfortable. They moved in together in 1995 and things were going smoothly. However, when she suggested they marry and he declined, she turned violent. Knight framed Price for stealing things from his company and got him fired. Though he initially kicked her out, a few months later they started seeing each other again. However, this time, he refused to let her move back in. According to their friends and neighbors, Knight's violence then began to escalate. In February of 2000, an argument between John Charles Thomas Price and Katherine Knight culminated with her attempting to stab him in the chest. He took out a restraining order against her in an attempt to keep his children safe. Toward the end of the month, Price let on that he was concerned for his safety and told his co-workers that if he ever went missing, it was because Knight killed him. On February 29, 2000, John Charles Thomas Price came home from work and followed his usual routine of checking in with the neighbors before going to bed at 11 p.m. Knight came home shortly after, made herself dinner, watched TV, showered, and then went upstairs. She woke Price, the 2 had sex, and he went back to bed. Then, Katherine Knight took a butcher knife from next to her bed, where she had always kept them, and stabbed Price 37 times. According to evidence, he woke up during the attack but could not fight her off. He succumbed to his wounds and Knight dragged his body downstairs, skinned him, and hung his body from a meat hook in the living room. Then, she decapitated him and cut up pieces of his body to cook in a dish with potato, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash, and gravy. She then made a dish for herself, though the half-discarded contents later found at the crime scene suggest that she couldn't finish her meal. She then lay down next to the headless, mutilated corpse of Price, took a large number of pills, and passed out. Price's co-workers heeded his warning the next morning and called the police after he didn't show up for his shift. The police arrived to find Katherine Knight's gruesome crime scene and immediately detained the comatose Knight. Once she woke up, she claimed to have no memory of the night before. In the kitchen, police found Price's head, boiling in a pot of vegetables on the stove. On the table, they found 2 full plates, each labeled with a name. In horror, the police realized that Knight had planned to serve John Price's body parts to his children. In October of 2001, her trial commenced, but it didn't get very far. For reasons that remain unclear, Knight changed her plea to guilty and the judge adjourned the case without testimony. She was escorted to prison that day and the judge ordered that her papers be marked, never to be released. For the first time in history, a woman in Australia was given a life sentence without parole. Jerry Brudos became obsessed with women's shoes when he was just 5 years old. The year was 1944, and the youngster happened to notice a pair of stilettos in a junkyard. Intrigued, he brought them home with him, much to the disdain of his mother. When his mother saw him with the shoes, she became enraged and screamed that he had better take them back to the dump. Brudos tried to hide the shoes from her, but she found out, and burned them. Something shifted in Brudos that day. He never looked at women's shoes the same way again. Despite his mother's obvious disapproval, he began to secretly steal shoes so he could create his own personal collection. As Jerry Brudos grew older, his obsession became darker. What was once merely creepy soon became deadly. By the late 1960s, Brudos had murdered 4 women in Oregon, and mutilated their corpses in horrific ways. In perhaps his most horrific act, he chopped one woman's foot off and kept it in his freezer, using it as a model for his collection of stolen high heels. As Brudos added to his stolen shoe collection, he also stole underwear. In 1956, Jerry Brudos attacked a woman for the first time. He was just 17 years old, and he had prepared well in advance for the assault. First, he dug a hole in a hillside where he planned to keep girls as sex slaves. Then, wielding a knife, he abducted a teenage girl, beat her up, and forced her to take naked photographs for him. After a stint of living back at home, he met and married 17-year-old Darcy Metzler. The new couple moved to Oregon, where they had 2 children. From the outside, Brudos seemed relatively normal. Friends and neighbors recalled that he neither drank nor smoked, and rarely if ever used profanity. But Jerry Brudos' sexual fantasies permeated his marriage. He demanded that his wife pose nude for him. He also asked her to clean the house naked while wearing high heels. And for a few years, Darcy complied. After a few years of marriage, Darcy and Jerry Brudos' relationship became strained. Darcy began to focus more on their 2 children, and she started to refuse her husband's more unusual demands. Brudos, feeling rejected, started to prowl the neighbors' houses for women's shoes and underwear, looking for an outlet for his obsession. Brudos had been walking downtown when he noticed a woman, specifically, her shoes. He followed her home and waited for her to go to bed. Then, Brudos broke into her house, strangled her into unconsciousness, and raped her. When he was done, he took her shoes and left. This encounter proved irresistible to Brudos. He later testified that the woman's limp body had aroused him. But the next time, Brudos didn't have to go looking for a victim, someone came straight to him. Linda Slauson was a 19-year-old encyclopedia saleswoman who came to Brudos' home on business. Brudos saw his chance. He pretended to be interested in buying an encyclopedia to lure her inside. While his family was upstairs, Brudos hit Slauson in the head and strangled her to death. After killing Slauson, Brudos stashed her body in his garage. He then cut off one of her feet and stored it in the freezer. In a sickening echo of his adolescent fantasies, he used the severed foot to model his collection of stolen shoes. Shortly thereafter, he tied Slauson's body to a car engine and dumped it into the Willamette River. While dressed in women's clothes, Jerry Brudos kidnapped his next victim, Karen Sprinkler, at gunpoint from the parking lot of a department store. In his garage, he forced Sprinkler to put on several different types of women's underwear while he photographed her. Brudos then raped her and hanged her by the neck from a pulley in the garage, strangling her to death. Horrifically, he had sex with her dead body several times before cutting off her breasts to make plastic molds. He then threw her body into the river, tied to a car engine to weigh it down. In the fall of the same year, Brudos killed again. College student Jan Whitney accepted a ride from Brudos after her car broke down, whereupon he strangled her and raped her dead body in the car. In 1969, Jerry Brudos abducted Linda Sally and brought her to his garage where he raped her, strangled her, and mutilated her body. Her corpse was also thrown into the Willamette River, tied to a car transmission. After police obtained a search warrant for Brudos' home, they found evidence that proved beyond a doubt that he was their man. There was nylon rope, photographs of the dead women, and, most horrifyingly of all, the trophies he had kept from his heinous crimes. Jerry Brudos was found guilty of the murders of Sprinkler, Whitney, and Sally and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. He escaped conviction for Slaussen's murder only because her body was never found. Jerry Brudos died in 2006 in prison, having served 37 years of his sentence. In the early 1990s, men began disappearing from the Indianapolis area. As police began to investigate these disappearances, they quickly found a pattern. All of the men were gay and had been visiting gay bars in the area shortly before they went missing. As word of the missing men began to spread through the community, the police got the break in the case they needed. A man who wanted to remain anonymous approached the police to tell them of a disturbing encounter he had at one of the local bars with another man who called himself Brian Smart. Smart had taken the man back to his home one night and initiated a sexual encounter. Smart asked the man to choke him while he masturbated. The man agreed, but when Smart began to choke him, he did so until the man began to pass out. The man shook of Smart and escaped that night, but the experience made him suspicious that this Brian Smart could be behind the murders. And after he happened to run into Smart a few months later, he made a point of taking down his license number. After police ran the man's plates, they found out that his name wasn't Brian Smart at all. It was Herb Baumeister. Born Herbert Richard Baumeister on April 7, 1947, he had a long reputation for being strange. As a child, he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia after constantly getting in trouble at school for disruptive behavior. There were even rumors that he had urinated on a teacher's desk. After a brief attempt at college, Baumeister tried out a number of different jobs. He worked at the State Bureau of Motor Vehicles for a period, until an incident where he urinated on a letter addressed to the governor. This incident solved the mystery of who had urinated on Baumeister's supervisor's desk a few months earlier and led to him losing his job. And after leaving this job, he took up work at a local thrift store. After 3 years, Herb Baumeister opened his own thrift store. And for a brief time, everything seemed to be going well. The store was turning a profit, and Baumeister and his wife, Julie, even opened another location. But within a few years, the business began to fail. The strain their financial problems took on the marriage led Julie to begin spending weekends at her mother-in-law's condo. Baumeister stayed behind, claiming he needed to look after the store. But what Julie didn't know was that in his spare time, her husband was cruising local gay bars. There, Herb Baumeister allegedly picked up men and invited them back to his pool house. After slipping drugs into their drink, he strangled them with a hose. Their bodies were then burned and buried on the property. In November, police acting on the tip they received asked to search the property and told Julie that they suspected her husband was a murderer. Julie didn't believe it at first. But then she remembered the fact that her young son had once brought home a human skull he found in the woods. Baumeister had told Julie at the time that the skeleton was part of an anatomical display his father, a doctor, had kept. Now, Julie was suspicious. But without enough evidence to go on, the police had to wait 5 months to conduct a search. Eventually, Baumeister filed for divorce and left home. Now alone on the property, Julie agreed to let the police carry out a search. There, they uncovered the remains of 11 men. With news that the bodies had been discovered, Herb Baumeister vanished. His body was eventually found 8 days later in Canada and his death meant that Baumeister couldn't be charged. And so, he officially remains only a suspect in the killings. But based on the bodies buried near his home, police eventually tied him to a string of murders stretching back to the 1980s. While we may never know exactly how many people Baumeister killed, police estimate that he may have been responsible for as many as 20 deaths. If true, this death toll makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of Indiana. Erzsébet Báthory was born on a family estate in Royal Hungary in 1560 or 1561, the daughter of Baron George VI Báthory and Baroness Anna Báthory. She descended from multiple noble lineages and included the King of Poland and the Prince of Transylvania among her relatives. Said bloodline was also one of generational inbreeding. Her parents were close relations, as was often the case with such marriages. It is thought that this may have been the source of a number of health problems that Erzsébet experienced as a child. She suffered from severe epileptic seizures that led to an array of pseudo-quackery cures that inspired many of the most insidious stories about the Báthory vampire legend. Because so little about Báthory's childhood can be proven with hard evidence, this is the period of her life where most of the speculation about the origins of her evil is centered. One favorite conspiracy is that her seizures were treated by rubbing the blood of a non-sufferer onto her lips or using a piece of their skull, thus igniting her insatiable bloodthirst. Another theory posited that she was trained by her family to be cruel, taught witchcraft, and exposed to satanic worship. There's no evidence to support any of this. What we do know is that she was raised in luxury in a level of privilege denied to the vast majority of Hungarian citizens. At the age of 10, Erzsébet was betrothed to Ferenc Nádasdy, a nobleman and heir to one of the wealthiest dynasties in the region, although he was technically of lower social standing than his wife-to-be. They married when she was 15 and he was 19, and Ferenc took the surname Báthory. Nádasdy's wedding gift to Báthory was his household, castle of Székely, located on the lower end of the Carpathian Mountains. Only a few years after the wedding, Ferenc was promoted to the chief commander of Hungarian troops and sent to war against the Ottoman Empire. Erzsébet was left behind to manage the family estate, defend her husband's affairs, and tend to the local people. Often, her duties included providing medical care and advice to destitute citizens. She also birthed at least 5 children, although some reports suggest she had another that died during infancy. Ferenc Nádasdy died on 4 January 1604 at the age of 48 after 29 years of marriage to Báthory. By this point in time, allegations of his wife's atrocities had become commonplace across the kingdom. Between 1602 and 1604, the rumors about Báthory's crimes became impossible for the authorities to ignore. Lutheran minister István Magyari made complaints against her, both publicly and at the court in Vienna, but it took until 1610 for King Matthias II to assign 2 notaries, András Keresztéry and Moses Zaraki, to collect evidence on the myriad charges made against her. Hundreds of testimonies were collected and what they revealed stunned the notaries. Girls as young as 10 were said to have been abducted by Báthory, beaten severely, and mutilated before freezing or starving to death. Some girls were allegedly burned with hot tongs. Others had parts of their faces bitten off. The most common motif of the Erzsébet Báthory legend is that she would bathe in the blood of her victims as a way to retain her legendary beauty and youth. It's a striking image and one that has endured longer than the truth of Báthory's life and crimes. It's also probably not true. Indeed, such stories didn't become part of her lore until she'd been dead for over a century. The claim first appeared in print in 1729 in the work of Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarozzi. No witness accounts from her trial or testimonies against her make reference to baths of blood. It seems to have been either complete fiction or the storytelling equivalent of a game of telephone, with the trust getting twisted up in hearsay, exaggerations, and religious scaremongering. On December 30, 1610, Báthory was arrested in her home, along with 4 of her servants. The trial itself was called into question, even at the time. Many witnesses could not offer first-hand evidence but would insist that they had heard from others about what Báthory had allegedly done. Many servants confessed to heinous crimes of their mistress but only after intense torture sessions. Given her major social status, it was decided that a public trial and execution would have been too scandalous, so instead, she was put on house arrest. She remained at the castle in Sedge for the rest of her life and died in her sleep on August 21, 1614, at the age of 54.